Children being held in detention on Christmas Island are suffering developmental problems, according to an inquiry by the Australian Human Rights Commission. The President of the Commission, Professor Gillian Triggs, is conducting a national inquiry into the impact of immigration detention on children. She recently visited the 315 children being held on the island and was accompanied by a paediatrician and child psychiatrist on that trip. Professor Gillian Triggs joins me now. Professor Triggs, welcome. How long was this visit and what kind of access were you granted?
Well, it was a one-week visit, and the departmental officials and the various security officers and so on were, I have to say, very open in giving us access to anything we wanted to look at, with a single exception of one camp where there were demonstrations, and that was seen as a security risk. But I'd have to say we had a very strong cooperation and assistance from the department. What
did you discover about the mental state of the children there?
Well, I'm, of course, not really qualified to make judgments, but we brought, as you say, a child psychiatrist and a paediatrician, and they are making just preliminary assessments of the children. We have data in relation to more than 200 of them whose parents gave consent to us discussing their concerns with us. The overwhelming sense is of the enormous anxiety, depression, mental illness, but particularly developmental retardation. That children are stopping talking. You can see a little girl comes up to you and she's just staring at you but won't communicate. You've got others with extraordinary physical difficulties that were not attended to in the countries from which they've come and which are now being exacerbated by the 8 months that typically these children and their families have been held.
What sort of long-term impacts could this sort of thing be having on these children?
Well, the medical evidence is that it has a very long-term developmental impact, and indeed I understand that the Australian Medical Association says anything more than a few days of these kinds of conditions is detrimental to a child. But these children are with very stressed adults, partly because of the trauma that they've been through, but most particularly because of the continuing uncertainty. Their claims to refugee status are not being met, are being abused by many in the media, that they are merely economic migrants, and this makes them depressed, angry, and so the children are observing the effects on their parents, and that's having a sort of circular effect ultimately on the children.
And what's the situation with that uncertainty now? Do many of them believe they're going to end up on some other Pacific country?
Yes, I think that they are very well aware that there's a very high likelihood that they will be taken, in the case of children for the moment, to Nauru, but very likely ultimately to Manus. And some of the children were saying, you know, it's dangerous there, what's it going to be like? They're very, very anxious about that.
What are Australia's international obligations in relation to this? And I've spoken to you about this before, but having been there now, what do you think there is evidence of in terms of Australia's international obligations?
Well, I have to be very cautious in responding to that perfectly appropriate question, and that is that this is just phase one of a national inquiry. But to state the objective principles of law, as a matter of very clear international law, children should not be detained for anything more than what is absolutely necessary for health checks and security checks. These children are being detained in what are, on any analysis, prisons on a remote island in shockingly hot, humid and difficult circumstances, in a way that cannot meet what you would imagine would be, the standard at an international level. The other point also is that this level of detention runs the risk of being arbitrary and again breaches those standards. The core principle, and the one that we come back to over and over again, is that Australia has an obligation to offer protection to these children. And at the moment, that protection is not being offered, and the conditions appear to be ones which raise the question of compliance with our obligations.
Well, I think we can bring up now some of the pictures that the children were drawing while you were there, and maybe you can talk us through some of these. And when you say that the shocking conditions, if you could elaborate on that.
Well, this is a particularly interesting picture because you will see that we've blocked out in the pink on the left-hand corner the identification number. These children are actually identifying themselves by their numbers, not by their names, which is shocking in itself. This is a very typical picture where they are asking for freedom. they're asking for help, and they perceive themselves as being behind bars and in prison. And this theme is repeated over and over again.
What do you believe the Australian government should do with these children now?
Well, we believe that the children should be brought to Australia, detained in community forms of detention in the initial stages, to get them into schools and to proper medical treatment for them and their families.
What about the government's argument that if they were to go down that path, that would encourage more people to get on boats from Indonesia and risk their lives coming to Australia, and there would be hundreds, if not thousands, more people die at sea because of that?
Well, I would challenge this notion that there's a direct relationship between them. There's no doubt that having physically stopped boats and turned them around, that has stopped asylum seekers reaching Australian shore. That, I think, in my view, has been the most powerful part of our asylum seeker policy. My impression from talking, this is my second visit to Christmas Island, and I've been to other detention centres, my impression is that when they get on the boats, they are absolutely desperate. And they are not aware of the nuances of Australian policy. They don't mind if they're assessed as refugees in Christmas Island, in Australia, or on Manus and Nauru. That's not the critical question. They want to be assessed and their status as refugees recognised, and they want to be resettled. So they're not really as aware as the Australian public might think they are aware of the nuances of how this policy is actually working. Many said to me, if we go and are sent to Nauru or to Manus, we're worried about those conditions, but above all, we want to have our claim to refugee status recognised and then resettled. So, to come back to your question, what we want to see is an end to what we see as an inhumane policy. Yes, we understand the government's got a political mandate from overwhelmingly the majority of Australians to stop the boats, to use the language. That's been successful on an objective basis simply by turning the boats. But our argument is, let's achieve this policy by doing it in a more humane way that meets our international standards, and they're not mutually inconsistent ideas.
Okay, Professor Gillian Triggs, thanks for coming in.
Thank you very much.